in the spirit of the times, or of the week anyway, this is a quick look at postage stamps issued in honor of the Olympics, but only stamps issued by the host country, not some other country that was partaking of the. And I'm only going to go from the first games in 96 up to mid-century, ending with London in 48. Altius fortius is Latin for ever faster, higher, and stronger. That is a motto coined by Pierre de Coubertin himself. The inspiration for the Olympic Games, naturally, is Greek, ancient Greece. However, as time went on in Western civilization, Greece and its customs were sort of completely overshadowed. Not its thinking, not its literature, not its genius, but overshadowed by Rome. And so most of what we think about Greek in a public sense, ancient Greek, is through a Roman filter. And that attitude affected Pierre de Coubertin himself. Also, I think it was his intention, and probably very wise, to use the Latin alphabet and not the Greek for the motto. The Greeks get a lot of credit in the Olympic Games and the whole ceremony, so they're doing all right. The idea for the modern Olympics, many people had it, but by far the two most important were a Greek nobleman named Demetrius Vikelas, and French, of course, Baron Pierre de Coubertin. I chose these two stamps to illustrate them. The one on the left is Vikelas, I hope I'm saying that right, and it is the only stamp I could find that portrays him. He's really fallen into the shadows of de Coubertin. And I chose the stamp on the right with a portrait of the Baron on it in honor of Hungary, which some of you may know or may not know, has the most extraordinary record in the Olympic Games. It has, over the years, it ranks 8th in number of Olympic medals received. This is a country whose population averages about 8 million people, and it's coming after the United States, Russia, Japan, Germany, France, places with populations 4, 5, almost 10 times the size. So I chose a stamp from Hungary just to honor their remarkable record in the Olympics. There's one other country that matches them, a small country that does extraordinarily well. Does anyone have any idea what I'm talking about? Finland. Finland wins medals vastly beyond their proportional population. I don't know why these two countries do it. There is a strategy to getting medals, and if you have a strong central committee, Olympic committee, you can try to emphasize getting medals in sailing, marksmanship, perhaps archery, things that are not considered the great popular sports like track and field, soccer, and so on. And in fact, this well-known dodge or trick, if you will, has always helped the countries that host the Olympics. There is a phenomenal and marked uptick in the amount of medals received by the host country in comparison to the number of medals they've ever received in the past and probably will receive in the future. Here is the first set, printed in 1896 for the Athens Olympics. It was engraved by Mouchon in Paris, who was doing the regular issues for France at that time, and it was printed in France. I'm not sure of the name of the printing house. That's why I didn't give it. I don't know if it was the official, but the government did it, or whether some private company having a name that made it sound very official did it. The stamps, as you see in this slide, are pastel colored. It makes them difficult to reproduce on screen. So I've added a few close-ups. The subjects include wrestling, the discobolus, which is a fancy word for the statue of the man throwing in the discus, and there is winged victory in a chariot. Other subjects included the stadium beneath the Acropolis, which I don't include here, but I do include the Acropolis itself on the high value stamp. And there is winged victory on foot as opposed to in a chariot. It's a relatively rare pose for victory, but there she is. I guess it's a she. It's her name is Nike, or Nike in Greek, and obviously the athletic company today is named after that goddess. The next Olympics were in France, not surprising since de Coubertin was so important in the movement. In fact, he wanted to have the very first Olympics in Paris, but he yielded to more sentimental and more convincing voices. So the first one was held in Athens. The next one was held in 1900 in Paris. And as so many of these Olympic Games were early on, they were in conjunction with a World's Fair. Now, the idea today of World's Fairs is kind of passe. You don't get them the way you used to. I think in my lifetime, the heyday of the World's Fair were the 1960s, when Montreal had one, Seattle had one, and New York City had its second. But the idea of a World's Fair, or Exposition Universelle, as they were often called, has faded. The idea of the Olympics has simply exploded. The next games were given to St. Louis in Missouri, and they again were held in conjunction with the St. Louis World's Fair, also known as the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. No stamps were issued that mentioned the Olympics, although a set of stamps was issued by the United States in conjunction with the Louisiana Purchase Exhibition. But the Olympics go completely unmentioned in 1904. In 1906, there was what is known as the intercalated games. These were not officially sanctioned games by the International Olympic Committee, but the Greeks were so happy, so pleased with what had happened in Athens in 1896. On the 10th anniversary, they decided to have an athletic contest open to all kinds of people.
My understanding is that these games were held because of a feeling at the time, particularly in Greece, that with the 1904 games, there had been a sort of a falling off of interest. It was felt that the 1904 games were not very successful. You mentioned that not too many countries participated.
They did not, no.
And so the idea of these 1906 games was to rev up interest in the games again.
To be successful, these games almost had to be in Europe if you were going to get representatives from different nations. You weren't going to get many people, as you point out, going to St. Louis in 1904. Yes, that's absolutely true. The Greeks did feel that the games were in danger of kind of just wilting on the vine. Mm-hmm. And so they put these games on. They were not, however, sanctioned by the International Olympic Committee. Some accounts of the history of the Olympics will include these games and the winners and so on and so forth, and others will not. Officially, I believe they are not considered Olympic Games. It is, after all, what we call nowadays a copyrighted term. You can't decide to have an Olympics in your neighborhood. You have to follow the International Olympic Committee. In any case, I think these stamps are very beautiful. They were printed in Britain this time by Perkins Bacon, and they were engraved. The earliest set in 1896, printed in France, was typographed. And you simply don't get the clarity that you do with engraved stamps. History has shown that. The next games were in London, but the British, of course, did not do commemoratives. Thank you very much. So there are no stamps referring to this from Great Britain. A similar thing happened in Stockholm in 1912, which was a supremely successful athletic event and international gathering. Sweden, however, did not choose to mention it on its postage. The war obviated the games planned for 1916. 1920, however, the games came back, this time in Antwerp or Anvers, Belgium. And the style of the stamps was very conservative, in my opinion. We still have the classic figures with virtually no clothes on, posing as a Hellenistic statue would have been. And even around the edge of the stamp, you'll see the classical motif, stone columns, the frieze, which is not too clear in this illustration, but this is a frieze going around the central part of the stamp. And it even includes the axe heads from fasces. 1924 Olympics were held in Paris. They were enormously successful too. And this is the first, just if you care to know this is the first games that were largely recorded on film. In fact, there is a 2 or 3 hour film of all kinds of footage from these games. It's fascinating, truly fascinating. The stamps, of course, look somewhat controversial because of the gestures on the stamps. That is an ahistorical interpretation of what that gesture means. Looking up this Olympic salute, which people believe was taken from a Roman salute, not Greek, but Roman, I found that, in fact, nowhere in Roman literature and nowhere in Roman extant art is this gesture mentioned or depicted. It was something that Europeans later in life attributed to the Romans and began to use. And they began to put it in, particularly in large historical paintings. Paintings by, is it Jacques David?
Jacques.
Jacques, thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry. So this gesture, which has been dropped, I don't think I even need mention the reason, is ahistorical. But it is completely innocent in this usage. And, well, I think it's a loss. I think that in this case, the bad guys win. Amsterdam in 1928 hosted the Olympic Games, and the Netherlands did put out a series of stamps. And thank God they broke with tradition. These are not Hellenistic semi-naked or naked bodies going through athletic poses. These are modern athletes doing modern sports, and I find it delightful and a real breath of fresh air. They include rowing, sailing, soccer. I mean, what could be more emblematic of world athleticism than the game of soccer? It rules the world. And I think I like these stamps very much because they're simple, but they have a slight exaggeration to them. In particular, say this boxer, whose arm looks about as long as his leg. That's to emphasize where the power comes from, I believe. Of course, there is a boxing glove on his hand, too, which makes it longer. Anyway, philatelically speaking, these stamps were semi-postals, but the surcharge was not put on the stamp. It was 1 or 2 cents, and you paid it at the post office. There's no need for it to be on the stamps. Really, not even ever on a semi-postal. You don't get the stamp unless you pay the surcharge. The next games were held in the United States, in Lake Placid, New York, and in Los Angeles, California. The United States is usually the stamps of the U.S. are conservative, at least historically speaking. And that tradition certainly continues here. You have the discobolus, you have a sprinter on his mark, and you have what is virtually a snapshot of a skier for the Winter Games at Lake Placid. Not very remarkable stamps. I think here, I'm not sure, but I think here is the first appearance of the Olympic torch on stamps honoring the Olympics. The two stamps to the right would seem very familiar to Americans at the time because they are designed to match the regular issue that was still in circulation at the time. As you can see here, there's very little variation. It's just as though the center had been altered. The next Winter Games were in Bavaria, and Germany put on, again, photorealistic illustrations of winter sports. It did the same thing for the Summer Games in Berlin. These are modern athletes doing modern sports, and the depiction is as though a snapshot had been taken of them. These stamps were also issued in souvenir sheet form. They were very popular, and they are available at very little money, even today. A little thing called World War II prevented the next two Olympics from being held. The first one to come after the war was the Winter Games at St. Switzerland. This is what Switzerland put out to honor the games. And these stamps are sort of unremarkable, but if you know Swiss stamps, these are so representative of the way the Swiss were doing stamps in those days, in particular, their semi-postals. Switzerland and Belgium are two countries that come to mind, to me at least, as issuing the greatest ratio of semi-postals to regular. I think, in fact, Belgium has issued more semi-postals than regular stamps. So this is Switzerland honoring the Winter Games at St. Moritz. Finally, the one I'm going to end with, because we're getting to the half-century mark, these are the stamps issued by Great Britain for the 1948 Games. I find them close to appalling. Why? Because the king and his floating crown, which I think looks just ridiculous, dominate the stamp rather than the subject that they're referring to, the Olympic Games. So these stamps, by the way, are typical of stamps issued late in the reign of George VI. They are, I think, amazingly unimaginative and stodgy. They are typically typographed. This is photo engraved, I believe. The Royal Mail didn't help matters. They issued a brochure describing the stamps. The one on the upper right, this is some artist's allegorical representation. This is from the Royal Mail now, of speed. Maybe the drug speed is what they're talking. I'm not sure. I simply don't get it. The brochure goes on to talk about the sixpence stamp. The Royal Mail tells us this is a representation of Olympic speed. Okay, you've lost me there. On this low note, I will bow out but that's a look at the stamps issued by the host countries for the Olympics.
I'd like to read something about the Greek stamps of 1896. The Greek government, in order to honor the revival of the Olympic Games and provide the committee with the necessary funds for the repayment of the loan, decided to issue a commemorative set of stamps. 50% of the net revenue from the sales of the stamps would be allocated to the Olympic Games treasury. The themes of the stamps, which originated from ancient representations, were proposed by Professor I. Svoronos. The designs were made by Swiss artist A. Guilleron. The steel dies were created by the French engraver E. Mouchon. You mentioned him. And the printing work was undertaken by the National Printing House of France.
Yes, I didn't know what the National Printing House of France meant. It sounds official, but we had the American Banknote Company, which wasn't part of the government. So I don't know. One more thing about the first issue was they were intended to be used only for the duration of the Olympic Games. By the way, the Olympic Games went on for months in the early days. They would have some event, some contest, and nothing would happen 4 or 5 days, often because they were in conjunction with the World's Fair. You didn't need something every day to keep people's minds on it. But in any case, with the original stamps, they were to be taken out of circulation when the games were over. That would have been a period of a few months. But wiser heads prevailed, and they said, well, we got the stamps, why not use them? And so eventually they all were used up as postage.
That's an Olympics cover.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
I collect, philately and international mail order fraud, and the New York Institute of Science is in Rochester is one of my fraud organizations. At the beginning of the 20th century, they sold a home study course in hypnotism and magnetism, and all it could do for your life. And I guess about, say, 10 years ago, I came across this lot in a Gertner sale. Without that Olympic cachet, this would be a $5 cover. And you can see it's December 12th, 1912. Ties in very nicely. So I got all excited about this. It started at 100 euros. I bid 150. And it sold for 900 euros. I wasn't even a player in the game. I was one of the little kids in the background. However, I have a good correspondent, Ed Fraser, but we put our heads together on this cover and started doing some research. And I'm not going to go into that, but the conclusion was that this cachet on this Swedish cover for the 1912 Olympics was actually put on this cover in Rochester by the New York Institute of Science to enhance the value of the cover.
Wow.
So it's a fraud cover.
The cachet there is surrounded by a frame that's broken.
Yep.
That looks intentional. What is that supposed to mean? Something?
I don't think so. I think part of the reasoning was this was modeled after an actual cachet, but that was used in Sweden during the Olympics. But that cachet the border was complete.
The problem with the cover also is that the date stamp is wrong. So it wasn't mailed during the Olympics.
Right. But so there's a bullet I avoided. So that's my contribution to the Olympics.